Thank you, Joe. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Liza Morehouse. I chair the Board of Trustees here at Morven, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you here this evening and to have folks on our hybrid presentation. And it's extremely exciting for us to be partnering with the Princeton Public Library to present this lecture and this series of presentations to you. It's a wonderful partnership, and we're just thrilled and very grateful. Thank you very much for being here with us. This series, or this civics focus, is a while in coming, and it has roots in the love and care for Morven of one of our greatest benefactors. She was an arch patriot and a staunch defender and believer of the Constitution, and that was Betty Wold Johnson. And she had been affiliated with Morven for many, many years, and always carried a copy of the Constitution in her pocket or her purse, and would frequently discuss constitutional and legal topics and topics of the day. And if there was a question, she would pull out her Constitution and say, "Look it on up," and she would hand it to the person she was talking to. Civics was very, very important to her. Civic responsibility was very important to her. The idea of democracy and freedom were critical to her being, and we decided to try to honor her legacy. And Greer and the Education Public Programs team came up with this idea, among others, but we're very happy to be kicking it off, and we're thrilled that Dr. Rosenfeld is here with us tonight. And we thank you for participating, and we hope you'll come back and tell your friends and participate with Morven in all of our programs. Thank you. Greer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greer Luce. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven. And thank you so much, Liza, for those opening words. This series, So You Think You Know Civics, is a new series in partnership with the Princeton Public Library. And I just wanted to thank Cliff Robinson specifically for being such a wonderful partner in developing this series. So the series seeks to unpack big questions about the past and present of the US government. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it was made possible through a sponsorship by the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. And the thought behind this series is really, as we're approaching the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026, is to engage in conversation about our complicated history through which many of America's founding ideas were formed, and the undeniable connections that we still feel in our world today. So with our partners and some amazing speakers, we hope to spark conversations through this series about topics in civics, looking at both past and present, ways we can take action, participate, and make change in our democracy moving forward. After this program concludes tonight, we will be sending everyone who's registered a recording of the program, but also a toolkit that the library has developed called Democracy in Crisis. And that includes a number of resources for folks to take action and learn through the wonderful work that the library does. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to hand it off to our speaker in a moment, who's going to give us a wonderful talk to get us started, but we will have time for Q&A. So please be thinking of your questions. For those online, I will have my laptop, and I'll be able to ask those questions as we go through the Q&A as well. So just put those in the Q&A box. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening's program, What is a Democracy? Sophia Rosenfeld is Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of A Revolution in Language, Common Sense of Political History, which won the Mark Linton History Prize and the Society for the History of Early Republic Book Prize, and Truth and Democracy, a Short History. She's also the co-editor of the 6-volume Cultural History of Ideas, which was recently named the Best Humanities Reference Work of the Year by the Association of American Publishers. Her work has been translated into many languages and supported by fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Studies here in Princeton, the Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and her current book project, Choice, The Invention of Modern Freedom, is forthcoming with Princeton University Press next winter. She also continues to write and speak in a wide variety of venues about the state of contemporary democracy and the challenges of free speech. Her essays and reviews on these subjects can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Nation, among many other outlets. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosen.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And thank you to Morven, and thank you to the Princeton Public Library. This is a really terrific kind of programming to be doing, I think. And the whole series looks really terrific. And I thank all of you for being here at, what hour is it? Basically dinner time, or at least cocktail hour or something like that. So anyway, I will not, my charge, I think, as I've understood it, is to not talk for too long, to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, make some general remarks, and then open it up for conversation, which is really more interesting to me, too, than to hear me go on and on. So I will say a few words about the sort of general subject, and then I hope you'll be thinking of things you want to talk about. And we can go in a lot of directions with the question, what is democracy, especially at the moment? I will be talking, though, just to clarify, that I'm really going to be talking about sort of modern liberal democracy, not democracy in antiquity. Our subject's really the present and how we got there. Of course, democracy is very old, right? So it was both practiced and thought about in antiquity. But for most of history, until we get really to the 18th century, where we're standing is a good moment to be talking, place to be talking about these questions. Until you get to the 18th century, democracy is not thought of in a positive way. It's really a recipe for anarchy. I mean, it's a pejorative to call something democratic. That starts to change, at least in practice, in the 18th century, with crises on both sides of the Atlantic, first in the British colonies in North America, and then soon thereafter in France, and then soon after that in Haiti, French colonies. And those crises produce something new, a return to a kind of ancient form of government, but in new trappings. It's called a republic in the 18th century. And it's really not until sometime, the French revolutionaries try it out a little bit, but it's really not till the early part of the 19th century in North America that democracy starts to be something people aspire towards rather than something they want to avoid. And I think that's important, that we not sort of think of it as kind of internal in some way. Ever since then, it's been evolving. There is no one model we can point to as there's democracy, find it. It's actually something that's always an aspiration, and arguably, especially since the Second World War, and maybe even more since 1989 and the end of the Cold War, it's been something that almost all states claim to be. The word democratic is in the most authoritarian states you can find, still call themselves democracies. So it's a term that now has become aspirational, like a gold standard. And I would say it's always something of a myth in the pure form that the people rule themselves. We don't really rule ourselves. We might rule, our household or something, but we don't do much direct rule other than that. So though it's more to do with an abstract idea that our existence gives legitimacy to the state. So let's think about definitions for a moment. If I were to give you a kind of basic definition of democracy, I'd probably say something like majority rule combined with rights protecting the individual. That's pretty straightforward. In the modern form, if you're going to say, how democratic is that government? What do we make of that? You're probably asking, do they have regular, open elections? But also, are there constitutional protections for the people's civil liberties, and some sense in which government is limited in how much it can coerce citizens. Most books will tell you some version of this. But I'm a historian, and I think there's more to it than just a formal plan for government. I would say that democracy is also a way of being in the world. It's a kind of experiential thing, and it's not just a formal government structure. And that sounds a little weird, perhaps, but upholding democracy, to my mind, is more than making sure the legal framework stays intact. That's important for sure, but it's also making sure that certain habits of body and mind that are connected to democracy prevail as well. Tocqueville, one of the great commentators still on democracy, is a Frenchman. He's traveling in North America in the early 19th century, grasped something of this. You know, he was really interested that democracy needs a culture of democracy to go with it, not just formal rules, not just a constitution. He pointed to some different ones. We can talk about those. But I'd like to point to three kind of habits of mind, rather than concentrate tonight on just sort of the formal parts of democracy. What are these habits, or I might say kind of low-level convictions, that democracy really requires of all of us to function? And they're pretty basic, but they're not the kinds of things you talk about very much until they're generally in crisis. That's often true about sort of the taken for granted. You don't really notice it till there's a problem. And I'll point to three that I think are particularly important. You may have others, or you may, want to challenge some of mine. One of those is some commitment to rules. Rules, I mean both formal legal rules, but also what you might call norms. Some commitment to the idea that though we disagree about lots of other things, we're going to play by the rules. And there are rules that we've sort of internalized. One example would be, the most obvious one maybe, would be after an election happens, it's understood that the rules are, first, that the majority wins, and that the other side have to essentially be graceful losers. They have to accept the turnout because those were the rules of the engagement. Well, like a sporting contest, right? Some of that is written in stone. Some of that is conventional, how you behave afterwards. That's one example of something I think a democracy requires, a habit of agreeing that we've sort of tacitly accepted the basic rules of the game. Okay, what's the other one? The other ones. Another one is some kind of commitment to truth. That's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I wrote a book about it recently, so that's one I'm particularly committed to. But I mean truth in a minimal sense, a kind of factual truth, not big truths. We're not going to agree about what is the nature of God, say, what we might agree about whether it rained yesterday or didn't rain yesterday, because we can probably empirically demonstrate that fact. And I mean truth in both a moral sense, that truth is the opposite of lying, and truth in an epistemological sense, that truth is the opposite of false information or misinformation or even disinformation. Why do we need truth? Because we have to trust each other enough to assume that what you say to me is what you mean, and that you're neither prevaricating nor providing me with false information. We need this in the government, certainly, to build policy, but even for voters, we need trust. Even to participate in civic life, we need some kind of basic trust of each other, that we start with some agreed upon facts, even as we're going to disagree strenuously, perhaps, about policies, values, approaches, all the things that we build on top of those kind of these are kind of low-level things. This is kind of low-hanging fruit, in a sense. Most of all, so if one would be rules, one is a commitment to truth. Democracy requires some sense of solidarity or fellow feeling with others. It doesn't mean everyone has to be your best friend. It doesn't mean you have to admire everyone even, but it has to matter to you when something bad happens to someone else or another group of people. And it has to matter to you even if you find them very different in their background or very different in their viewpoints, that they're still, in some sense, we're in this together, and that it matters even people you don't know far away who live in ways you might not even approve of, that there's some basic conception that we share some commonality. Maybe that's your town, maybe that's the nation as a whole. How do we absorb these kinds of habits of mind? Sometimes through education, and sometimes through the doing, participating in civic life. I see you have one of your sessions is going to be about participation. People participate in local government, but they also participate in civil society and all kinds of organizations, from religious groups to civic organizations, sports leagues, school PTAs, everything of the sort. Gives people kinds of habits of listening to others, respecting them, following rules, some of the things that I'm talking about. It isn't clear on the surface that democracy requires this, but if people are too atomized, it's hard to imagine how democracy can completely work. All right, so now we get to the problem. The problem, I probably don't have to persuade you, or you wouldn't be here this evening, I guess, is the reason that we're talking about them is partly a long tradition of civics here at Morven, obviously, but also some generalized sense that some of these things are in crisis. A crisis that maybe many of us didn't quite expect, because the trend after 1989 was actually towards the idea that the world as a whole was growing. It wasn't perfect, but it was moving in more democratic directions, largely speaking. More democracies around the globe, more opportunities for more people. What's in crisis? It's easy to say that what's in crisis in part is what happens in Washington and what happens in state capitals, where you can, point to a kind of politics of polarization, of political stunts, of a kind of unwillingness to create compromises. That stuff's kind of easy to see. But it might also be that there's a crisis in this kind of culture of democracy that sustains the politics itself. I think there is something of a crisis. It can be exaggerated, but there is something of a crisis in those ideas about rules, solidarity, and truth. And I'm sure you all can think of examples, at least for some of those. What's interesting here is that the United States is not alone. Other large democracies are facing similar moments, from Brazil to India, much like the US, kind of not clearly heading in one direction or another, but shifting from election to election, and with very divided populations, polarized. And it is a good kind of open question, will democracy survive in all of these places? Some of that, again, is structural, and some of that has to do with the commitments of ordinary people, all of us, citizens, to the practice and kind of living out of democracy, which, if you believe Tocqueville, shapes our everyday life too. We're not always thinking of ourselves as doing democratic things. We're not voting every day of the year, but our participation in daily life and our lives are shaped in many ways by the political culture in which we live. And so I see these as very closely tied. So you might ask, and this is what I'll talk about for the last few minutes, and then I'll open this up, I hope, to you. What happened? And what can we do about it? Those would be sort of the most obvious next set of questions, right? So, sources of the crisis. All crises have multiple sources. There's not one thing we can point to. It's not just, we got social media and it's all been downhill ever since then. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. I will point to a few things that I think are important in thinking about this. One, and most of these are not unique to the United States. A few of them are, but not really. One is growing and sometimes extreme economic disparities, the sense of many people in many places that they've essentially been left behind by a globalizing world, that there's kind of winners and losers in this, what we would call kind of the modern cosmopolitan global world. It makes it hard for people to feel solidarity, quite understandably, when they share very little. So a kind of, sometimes called a politics of resentment, but I think that puts sort of too much burden on the people who feel that way. In some sense, I would just say we're talking about a population that's pulling apart, especially compared to the middle of the 20th century, in terms of wealth and poverty. Combined with that is another kind of pulling apart that I might call cultural heterogeneity. And in some ways, cultural heterogeneity has been wonderful in the modern world. The fact that people, more and more people from more and more different kinds of backgrounds participate in what are more and more multicultural democracies. And that's true not just here, but in nations of Europe, and especially in places like India, South Asia as a whole. This is a product of immigration, civil rights movements in many places, decolonization, people moving for economic opportunity, and of course, people displaced by war. But the flip side of the wonderful cultural heterogeneity is also, and our pluralism, is also more and more, in some sense, a harder and harder sense of how to find commonality. What will be the shared cultural experience of people? How do you preserve pluralism, but also create some kind of shared or common investments? In the US, in particular, that is not helped by the fact that we have very few common institutions that cross these cultural or economic divides. Not everybody goes to public schools. Public schools themselves are very different in one place to another. We don't have a required military or volunteer corps of any kind. Some nations have more institutions that do this kind of shaping work. That said, I will mention the internet, and I will say that being online has become a common experience, but it's actually pulled us all over the world away from each other rather than towards each other. It's not so much necessarily the technology as the business models and the legal framework around it, which have, understandably, these are for-profit companies that have created our public sphere, have prioritized a kind of sensationalism and polarized politics in ways that have pulled us into emotion-driven and often fact-less politics and away from any kind of common core. I'm happy to say more about that if you'd like. And finally, I would say there's one more thing that's made democracy hard these days. And that's the sense that some of the problems we face right now are almost too big for the structures we have. A nation can't tackle climate change on its own. Our economies are all globalized. Anything that happens in one place will have offshoots, byproducts will happen everywhere. The movement of peoples itself, the enormous refugee problem in this country, people around the world, the problem at the borders in this country is a product of all of this too, and it's hard to see how any of these problems can easily be solved within the existing party structures, within the existing national frameworks. They're all global problems of sorts. So I think there's a little bit of nihilism that emerges from the idea sort of, how do we solve climate change as a kind of problem? So what can we do? That's, of course, the hardest part of all this conversation. Much easier to diagnose the problem than to talk about what we can do. Some of this change, some of the strengthening of democracy, if we still believe in this framework, has to come from above. It doesn't mean citizens shouldn't push for it, but we need the state to act in various ways. If you want, for instance, to limit or ameliorate extremes of economic wealth and poverty, you probably need a higher minimum wage. If you want to strengthen voting, you need to make sure the laws are very secure and effective in allowing the maximum number of people to vote securely at all times. But some of this has to come from the ground up, too. We also have to work, I think, at cultivating democratic habits that will help make it possible for people to experience democracy, to not just think of it as something you need to do. It was mentioned once a year when you go vote. And some of that is, I suppose, what we're doing right now. I mean, the very fact that you're sitting here on a weekday evening, when you could be doing something else, wanting to talk about these questions, and the engaging with others. I assume not everybody knows each other in the room. That's part of democracy. This is part of what I would call free speech practices. Free speech is necessary to democracy. It allows us to have the debates we need and hear all the information we need in order to be effective citizens. It allows us to hold our representatives accountable. It allows us to protect the dissenter on the fringes, the person whose ideas don't conform to the majority. But it's also not absolute. It's also a practice. It's also something that needs to be tried out and modeled. And it too needs rules. You're all engaging them right now because you're very politely letting me stand here and talk and being very quiet, and we'll probably do things like raise our hands in a little bit, which is all part of kind of rule following. We'll cultivate practices. We need to cultivate practices of starting from facts and listening and knowing how to disagree with people, but trying to find the places where we agree empirically on something. And there's a kind of respectful listening and respectful engagement that's essential, which is part of this kind of solidarity with others, which means we don't have to agree. In fact, it's better for democracy. It's a contentious form of politics. If we don't all agree, we're not looking really for consensus in the sense of 100% people going in this direction rather than that one. But we're willing to treat other people as the kind of loyal opposition, which means listening to them and trying to understand where they're coming from and why they're saying what they do, and seeing if you can find some common ground. So I just want to end with this. Democracy is hard, it's messy, it's adversarial, it is not the easiest form of politics to practice. There are good reasons people were very skeptical about it for so long. Even in the Federalist Papers, even in, if you've read any of this, the Federalist Papers were written right after the Constitution to try to persuade people that this could work. Most people would have thought, a republic in an area this big, with this many people of different backgrounds? And that was in a moment, of course, when the only people who were active citizens were white, propertied men who'd lived for some number of years in one place and did certain professions that were reputable enough to be voters. Now imagine millions more people, a much more diverse group of people who are citizens, and think how much harder in some ways it's become. In positive ways, but in ways that require maintaining. The question then is really more, why hold on to it? Why hold on to such a difficult form of politics, especially in this moment? And I will end by saying, I think the one wonderful thing about the promise of democracy is that it is indeed aspirational. It's not an achievement. It's something, it's out there. And the way it works is that you can keep trying over and over to get closer to it. Every time you vote, every time people bring up a new issue, every time new policies emerge, we're in a sense moving towards that target we're never going to get entirely to. But it inspires innovation, it inspires trying again, it inspires people trying to work together to change things. And these are very positive goals. So I will end there and hope that I can persuade you that democracy is an aspiration worth having, and that the more we do of this sort of thing, talking to each other, the more likely it is we can hold on to it. Thank you. And now, your thoughts.
Thank you enormously. It was wonderful, a wonderful, inspiring inauguration of this series. Two quick things. I make a point of seeking very different views than we get here in, here in town in person. So I very selectively pay attention to Facebook discussion groups. God help me. One I'm very much focused on, about 760 people, not too huge. Rules that some people disobey, but it helps me think hard and respond as best I can to very, very different views from my own. The other is, since I think really 2017, I have thought very seriously and deeply, what could possibly be a, if you will, silver lining, a good thing that we're experiencing, Trump and MAGA. What I've decided, and I think it's kind of obvious, we're paying vastly more attention to civics and all of the elements of governance and democracy than many of us ever did before, vastly more, in a way that I found exhilarating and informative and really exciting. And I mean everything, the non-lawyers, if you will, everything. We're paying attention and we're learning, well, I guess some of us, but we're really, really experiencing these details that are just fabulous. And I know we really look forward to the rest of the series. You did a great job. It's very inspiring. It's really swell. Thank you.
Everybody. There are some paradoxes in all of this. So you're right that in the last presidential election, more people voted than ever before, which is rather extraordinary at a moment where we're also imagined there was a crisis for democracy or democracy was on the line. So there is always the possibility, you're right, that the kind of knockoff effect is galvanizing people in one direction or another, but making people into participants.
Thank you for your presentation. Speaking of voting, don't mean to put you on the spot, but in your work that you do, could you share some of the numbers or the facts and figures about voting, like in the state of New Jersey, the percentage of people who vote, just a few sort of facts and figures for us. It is
It absolutely is. And I should tell you that I'm probably the worst person for that question, precisely because I'm really not a political scientist. I don't study democracy in an empirical fashion like that, sort of number crunching. And it's important that some people do that work. I don't, so I don't have figures for New Jersey. New Jersey is actually a rather distinctive state in many ways, as I don't have to tell you. It's obviously, I've lived in a series of swing states. I live in Pennsylvania now, and I lived in Virginia before that, where politics are quite different because, New Jersey, the voting is in the sense at the national level rather preordained. So it's not studied as much as kind of, purple areas, which I have largely lived in. What I do study is, I would describe as the kind of cultural and intellectual history of democracy. And that means democracy, a little bit as I mentioned, is a kind of set of what I would call practices in political culture. And I also study the history of voting as an activity itself. And there's a very interesting history of voting. In the 18th century, nobody paid very much. Voting right away was going to be considered the hallmark of what self-rule was. But nobody paid almost any attention to how voting was going to happen, when it was going to happen. It was almost like an afterthought. You can't find much in the 18th century. And it turns out that some people voted completely collectively, like all the people in favor moved to this side of the room, and all those moved this way. And sometimes people put corn in a pot in the front with two different names on it, and sometimes they used secret ballots, but there was no sense that there was a single standard for how voting should happen. I almost think there was a second great revolution in democracy in the late 19th century, when the secret ballot and the idea of one man first, one vote became prevalent, and that had to be protected in secrecy so that because you had inner inclinations and predilections and preferences that needed to be realized by voting. there was a real shift to the idea of the individual voter. And that at first that was a male voter, but not that much longer. It took only a few more decades before women too were individual voters. And now we can't really imagine voting as a collective activity. We also can't imagine telling, well, I suppose we can, there are some categories of adults that still can't vote in this country, but we largely imagine that any citizen should have at least one vote for that one person. But this was a really late invention, and I'm very interested in that fact too, that what we think of as voting is quite a modern phenomenon. It's only really existed for about 100 years. And of course, we know that for Black people, it's more recent than that.
Sorry, I have some questions online here.
Oh, great.
Has there been another time in our history when democracy has been in crisis in the ways it is now?
It's a great question, and it's one that people often ask also the question about truth too. You know, is this? And historians like to fudge things, and they say, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. In some ways, yes, we've often had crises in democracy, but they're never identical because the circumstances change, the technologies change, the issues change, the voters change. All the elements are different. But I guess if I were going to point to a moment that I think was important in thinking about these questions, I would look at not the coming of the Civil War, because that's sort of maybe too dramatic for a moment, but I would think about the late 1960s, in which there was a kind of a moment in which there was a challenge to official truths from a lot of sides. And there was also some sporadic violence around those questions, though we did not enter a period of civil war and the nation did not fall apart. What's interesting, though, is I think that in this moment, much of the challenge to establishment notions of kind of what do we know and what are institutions are coming from the right side of the political spectrum. Surprising to see the right challenging things like the CIA, the FBI, the NIH or the New York Times, which would have been exactly the institutions, governmental and non-governmental, that would have been challenged from the left in the moment of the Vietnam War, for instance. So this is not also a politics in which the pattern, I don't know if did this just go up? It's kind of going on. In which the pattern is exactly the same. But you can find moments in which I think if we went back to the 60s, we know how it ended now, but you might have said, and of course we, knock on wood, have not had the assassinations of the 1960s, but you might have thought, here's a moment in which the future of the country looks really uncertain, and there is not a consensus about how we should live, who should have a say, what our institutions should look like. A challenge to the press, a challenge to universities, a challenge to government agencies. Those all happened in the 60s. Some of you may well remember this moment. Some of you will not, looking around the room. And some of those are happening again today, but with different political valences. So it's a great question.
Enough to remember during the Second World War that we used to sit out on the porch at night and listen to our radio. And we all listened to the same program, which would tell us what was happening in the war. And we were very cohesive because of that. And then I also remember when television first started, that we only had 1 or 2 stations. And we would listen to those stations in the evening in order to get our news. And this was something that everybody did. Around mealtime, they would listen to the news of the day. But today, where do you get the truth? And you have so many different stations. You don't know which one you should listen to. I travel to the Midwest in order to visit relatives. I can't find the New York Times at a store in the Midwest. I can only find very limited television programs in the Midwest. So people in this country some people have very limited types of places where they can get news or they can get the truth. So what would you recommend in order to fulfill one of your conditions of truth? How can we have more truth in this country?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. This
No, you use the handheld.
is the handheld?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yep.
good. I can also yell loudly.
No, you're good.
All right, and I mean, you're absolutely right, that one thing that has certainly changed is the proliferation of different outlets for information. And you can pick your information to suit your politics or to suit your particular group identity in lots of ways that were not possible before. Some of that has to do with deregulation. And radio, for instance. The 1980s is the beginning of the moment of talk radio that becomes highly partisan, but it's not just because there was a political phenomenon, it's because the radio itself was deregulated. Cable TV a decade later produces, again, new possibilities. Then the internet, it becomes very cheap to produce news in lots of different places. So the world of sort of NBC, CBS, and ABC disappeared. There are good and bad things about this, right? The bad part is exactly what you're pointing to. Very little sense that we have a shared source for anything. Even our facts look different. Though, of course, the press has always been partisan, going back to the 18th century, the penny press in the 19th century. There's always been a highly partisan press, but there was some sense, certainly with radio and television, that there were sort of authoritative voices that would give us some kind of consensual material. One advantage to the new moment we're in might be that, well, two, actually. One is that we do have access to non-mainstream points of view. It was harder once upon a time to find news that didn't correspond to establishment sources. And it was harder to get your own views out there, because if you didn't have access to, writing an op-ed for the New York Times or publishing your book with Random House, you probably didn't have, you could tell your neighbors, you could tell your friends, but you didn't have much of a pulpit. Whereas now with the internet, of course, you can acquire followers for free. Nobody has to vet you or authorize you. That said, I also think there's some disastrous aspects to completely unvetted information. And so you're talking about two things, really. One is unvetted information, and the other is a lack of consensual information. There have been some interesting suggestions about what to do about this. One that I think is very important is to strengthen local news, which sounds like it would move away from the idea of a single source. But people used to rely a lot on relatively apolitical local news. Local news was very trusted until quite recently, and print journalism in locality has largely died. I don't know in Princeton whether you have, and Princeton does have good news, right? And this is probably because it's a town that can support this kind of enterprise. It's an unusual place in terms of the education levels and prosperity of residents that would make it distinctive in some ways. But local news has to be encouraged. The other points to your point about whether we need to start thinking about the internet as maybe something more like a public utility. Something that is a public space that is not privatized, that has to be run according to a different set of values. That's hard, because we'd have to figure out who do we trust to run this, right? Would it become political quickly? But there have been some interesting proposals for thinking, could there be something like an equivalent of a combination of NPR and a public utility version of the internet that would be a kind, apolitical is the wrong word because there's no such thing, but let's say a more reliable more fact-based, less deliberately ideological version of the news that most people get now. For, large groups of educated people, people will still largely trust, to a certain degree, the major journalistic outlets, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, but those are not really widely read across the country. Those are not really the same as CBS News in the old days. So it's an important question.
It's like my favorite topic in the whole world. Oh, okay.
There you go.
Thank you. And that was such a great presentation and very energizing. I loved your comparison with the 60s because I've been making that all the time. And it was, imprinted on me as a younger person. And it just reminds me that, yeah, I've lived through this before. I can get through this again. And my older friends should not be paranoid and freaking out the way they seem to be, because we're going to get through this. That's my message in general. But could you talk a little bit about capitalism and how that plays into this? Because my kids are obsessed with the post-capitalist world that they hope to inherit. And the wealth inequality is definitely linked to that.
It's an interesting moment. I'm glad you brought that up. I teach college students, both undergraduates and graduate students. So I've got kids that age myself. So I feel like I, know something about what it feels like to be 20 years old or more or less these days. For better or for worse, when I finished college, down the road, some 30 billion years ago, there was very little discussion of, should we have a democracy? Is capitalism good? I think there was looking back, I think we were rather naive. We did not question very much the world we were entering. We questioned elements of it for sure, but not the whole framework. And my sense, and many of you in the room may have close contact a lot of the time with people this age too, is that young people today are sort of asking why, and why are we stuck with this, about many of the things that would have seemed absolutely obvious to somebody of my generation. One of those is about democracy. Is this really a democracy at all? Is there some better way to organize our state? And the other is certainly about capitalism. Why has capitalism failed to lift all boats? It's done some wonderful, they're all impressed with things like startups. They love, their entrepreneurialism, they're all in for that stuff. But they're also asking, in many cases, why it's been so unsuccessful in pulling so many people out of poverty around the world, but also just really close to home. I live in Philadelphia. It's the poorest big city in America. There's so much entrenched poverty in Philadelphia, of the kind where people live well below the poverty line and have almost no prospects in terms of exiting that. And I do see why young people are asking, how is this possible in this city that's got these, major medical centers and gleaming office towers and finance firms and is in the shadow of New York, and yet it hasn't worked? And what would assist? So they're asking rightly, what might work instead? And I think climate change is for them the icing on the cake, where they sort of say, if we keep doing business as usual, we also potentially, doom the planet. And I'm trying to sort of channel the kind of pessimism that I often hear from young people these days. They're not entirely pessimistic. As I said, they're excited about certain things. But it might be good for us that they're asking these kinds of big questions. I wouldn't discourage it. They're asking these kinds of questions about global affairs too, often in ways that can seem kind of hostile. But again, thinking about the Middle East, for instance, but again, they're kind of asking why business as usual has to look the way it does. And that's, back to your 60s moment. I think those questions were asked very similarly in the 60s by young people. Then in the sort of 70s and 80s, there was kind of a lull, and into the 90s. And then the financial crisis, political crises have shifted the conversation. Young people are much more political than they were when I was a student in the 80s.
Hi, I was wondering if there were other democracies that you said are failing now, like in India, Israel, other places in the world, that where the governmental systems, where the representatives are as polarized as they are now. And was there another period in American history when people seemed to operate as a bloc and not as individual thinkers, even though that might have had subgroups?
It's a very interesting question, and it points a little bit to the particularity or the unusualness of the US, because we don't have a parliamentary democracy. And so we don't form coalitions across parties in the same way. So even somewhere like Israel, which I would describe as highly dysfunctional as a democracy with extremely polarized positions, part of that has come from the creating of alliances necessary for a parliamentary system to function. In the US, of course, we have two parties alone. We sometimes have a third party kind of spoiler candidate, but they're not really that important to how government works. And is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing in that it doesn't produce compromises, but it does not seem that parliamentary democracy has done any better as of late than our two-party system has. Initially, going back to the 18th century, parties were bad things, factions they were called, and factions were really the thing you wanted to avoid. The French revolutionaries were panicked about factionalism. So were the sort of founding fathers generation. Over time, the same way democracy stopped being a pejorative, party or faction became a positive thing, slowly. And it seemed like a way to create platforms, structures, something between the people and the state. And parties have often done some good things by helping, in a sense, vet candidates and produce possibilities. They're a little weaker right now than they've been. Is this good or bad? Time will tell. But what's interesting at the moment is that neither parliamentary democracies nor party democracies like our own have avoided this kind of extreme polarization in this moment, which leads me to think it's less to do with the structure and more to do with the kind of crises of the moment, the political culture part, than something about the framework itself.
Do you think, do you think there's any hope for us to have a good school system? I look at things and I just think that neighborhoods shouldn't fund their schools. The schools should all be beautiful community centers and great education, and teachers should be paid. And I feel pretty hopeless about that ever happening.
Yeah, and it's a very important question, especially in New Jersey, right, where the local taxes do an awful lot to shape schools and the kinds of, and that's true around, I believe, where I live in Center City in Philadelphia, where I believe the last time I looked at the numbers, the city spends about $12,000 per pupil, and on the main line, just over the border in Lower Marion Township, which has particularly good schools, sort of famously strong public schools like Princeton, the number is like 28,000 or something. It's more than double. And you might imagine that the students in the city had higher needs to begin with in terms of what they would require in a school. So, I mean, the question of wealth inequality obviously has effects that go simply beyond what kind of car people drive. They start at the most basic level of what kinds of education people are receiving. This has long been the case in the US. It's not new, and it does not seem that we're closer to solving that problem. Americans have an incredibly heterogeneous system of educating young people and older people. You know, we have public schools, private schools, parochial schools, alternative schools, some public, some private, some charter. And then above that, when you get into higher ed, where I reside, you have every possible kind of higher ed as well. It's almost hard to talk about schools in the US. I mean, even if I talk about, people say, you know, what's the crisis in the university? I would say to you, do you mean public commuter schools? Do you mean wealthy private institutions? Do you mean small liberal arts colleges? the heterogeneity has made American education exciting in certain ways. So there are some wonderful sides to American education, but it's never been a particularly equitable system, and I don't know how we might easily get there. But I'm sure maybe there's some educators in the room who have much better ideas than I do about what this would take, especially for New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey schools, so, yeah.
I do have to jump in now.
Please do.
I came in as a confused person. I'm still confused. But
Sorry.
I am an educator and, but well retired, and I come from the Midwest. And it's the content in the schools. And especially when, well, my voice is loud. Can y'all hear me in the back?
Anybody's been a teacher.
Minnesota, loud voice.
And a teacher.
Hey, yeah, it's the content of the different schools. It goes by town, just as libraries. Libraries service the community they are in. Schools service the community, whether it's 500 children coming into the school or a really huge one. But the content, if that can be, there are national standards, and but then again, parents can rise up in anger, and they have been recently. This is the 1960s revolution right here with parents and their children, and they don't want their children to know things. It's just an incredible mess, and I think this is a big deterrent to democracy in and of itself. And for instance, for truth, kids need to be taught how to find truth. They don't need to accept what their parents say as truth. They don't need to accept what their minister says as truth. They need to be taught how to search for truth and go out in the woods and hug a tree.
Yeah. That's terrific. And I couldn't agree more that one of the things that our schools will have to do that they haven't done in the past, because the materials students received in the past were vetted at every stage. You know, when you took a book out of the librarian had chosen that book, but before that, the book was published by a publisher, and the publishers had vetted that material. There were every level of. Now students have access to everything, and one part of education will have to be both teaching students how to come to solid truths, but also how to have a healthy skepticism about received information. Not crazy conspiracy theory, but a healthy skepticism that says, how would I verify if that were true? Could I find alternative answers to that? And that will have to enter curricula. It has in a lot of countries now. We're a little behind on this kind of K-12 media literacy. And I would call it sort of an education in, maybe, it sounds too fancy, but an education in epistemology, which is what is truth and how do you find it? So I'm agreeing with you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. I wish I didn't have to wait till I was this age before I learned as much as I did during the first half hour of this talk about democracy. Why isn't that taught in our schools? I have a slightly different view of education and the diversity that you were describing in the parochial schools, charter schools, district public schools, independent schools. What I find remarkable is the extraordinary consistency in that everyone learns Pythagorean's theorem. Everyone learns photosynthesis. Everyone learns things that things that may not be very relevant to them or their future, and yet virtually every American child learns it. And how does that happen despite the autonomy that in theory exists? Why is it that virtually every American child is reading textbooks published by one of 3 or 4 companies? It's actually not the Wild West in terms of information sources that a 4th grader receives. There's a lot of control. And so my question is, how can we leverage that conformity among the diverse public schools in order to promote the type of education that would result in an informed citizenry for a healthy democracy.
That's a very interesting, I mean, it's a very interesting way of framing it, because I guess, you know, it's a glass half empty, glass half full kind of position. But that's it. It is interesting to ask, and I'm thinking of schools where, you know, one reads all the time about schools that are sort of off the map in terms of what the conformity element. They either have a theme that's very particular to them, or they belong to a method, say Waldorf or something, or they educate, or they're bilingual schools and they do something completely different. I was thinking mainly of heterogeneity, but you have a good point, I think, about the fact that there are certain kind of assumptions as to what an educated person needs to know. And that's why we have things like SATs, right, which are sort of on the way out and on the way in again. So and how does this happen, and is it a good thing? And this, I guess there would have to be two answers again about, and you might know much more about this than I do. One is that there are some formal structures in states, for instance, that create curricula, that create that vet textbooks. So there are some kind of equalizing factors, but some probably goes to just norms, expectations that people who have become teachers and principals and superintendents and heads of school impart, which are some notions of what does an educated person need. And they have changed over time. I just heard this afternoon, I was at the university across the street, and I just heard what the entrance requirements were in the 1740s for the university. And they were, somebody came to your house and checked if you could translate, if you could read the Latin of, you had to do Cicero, and I think it was Virgil and Cicero, and then you had to read the Bible in Greek and turn it into either Latin or English. But they didn't have Calc BC, and they didn't have a whole bunch of other things that you now probably have to have before you can attend Princeton, right? So why were those the standards? I think it was simply widely understood that the basic skills you would need would be some facility to move between Greek, Latin, and English, and to be able to read major texts. I'm going to go out on a limb and imagine that if you went up to Harvard in the 1740s, it would be pretty similar. Though you know, Presbyterians and Congregationalists and different politics, et cetera, it was sort of the understanding, the tacit understanding of what education was. So perhaps there are some kinds of norms we expect now. A certain level of math is necessary to do this. Using a computer in some basic way is essential. It has to do with our expectations about jobs, about education levels. And as you say, some of it has to do with things we don't actually need to know, right? That you can function very well without. So it would actually, I don't have a good answer for you. I'm just thinking through this sort of out loud. I imagine at all times there's some tension between the norms and the heterogeneity when people say apply to do a charter school that's, you know, a music immersion school or an Afrocentric school or any of the varieties of kinds of things that people have tried out. Even among small children, you can send your kids to a Montessori, a Waldorf, a religious school, but all kinds of different possibilities, even for the smallest children in terms of how they might learn.
Isn't there a trend of lowering standards? At least it seems that way. And isn't that really counterproductive in certain respects?
I don't know if I can answer that in a factual way, because I don't, you know, and it depends standards where and at what level of schooling we're talking about. Again, my own knowledge is much more about higher ed than K to 12. So I don't think I want to answer that definitively, lest I be misleading. I think what one might say is that standards themselves are always evolving because what we think we're looking for is always evolving. Whether they're higher or lower, I mean, in my example of the Greek and Latin, certainly that's a higher standard for Greek and Latin than we have today. But it might be a much lower standard for economic knowledge. So I think standards evolve because we imagine both workers and citizens, and we imagine sort of thoughtful people too, differently in different times and places. We're also training people these days largely for a secular world, most of the time outside of religious schools, which means the expectations are quite different also than in earlier forms of schooling, which were almost always affiliated with a religious tradition and a church. Yeah.
I don't know the institutions, but some institutions that actually, to some degree, eliminate grades. And it's like, I guess there could be an argument for that, but, pluses and minuses of doing that.
That's a really interesting question about grades, whether grades are motivating or demotivating. So, for instance, among all the law schools, the most elite of all, Yale Law School, doesn't have grades. And it's been a longstanding practice. And how is that possible? Because the other ones all put you in ranks and, you're always moving up and down a decimal point. Same with progressive education at younger ages. There have long been arguments for various forms of progressive education that grades are deterrents, that they create kind of conformity, they create, learning for the test, that they are antithetical in various ways to learning. Other people have argued, I'm a product of more conventional schools where grades were sort of supposed to be motivating and supposed to help you figure out how you were doing vis-a-vis your peers in a more kind of competitive environment. I don't think there's a definite answer to that question, in other words. I think like many things, education can be, you might also say that there are people who are going to thrive in different kinds of educational settings. One might produce greater creativity, the other might produce higher standards. That kind of heterogeneity, I think, is a positive thing.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know if this is on. Thank you so much, Professor Rosenfeld, for an amazing evening and response to the question of what is a democracy. Thank you all for some amazing questions and comments and thoughts. And for those online too. So if we could all join me in giving Professor Rosenfeld a round of applause. And before we go, I know I'll get you on your way shortly. I did want to mention our next program in this series, which is on June 12th. Will be What is Citizenship? And we have a speaker joining us who is very appropriate to the conversation we were just having, Holly Corby, who's written a book on civic education and building better citizens in schools kind of in our modern times. So I hope you'll all join us for that next talk, and thank you so much.